Hello everyone, and welcome to the long-awaited part 3 of the SimplePlanes tutorial series. In the last two episodes, we went over center of mass and center of lift balancing, the different types of engines, be that propeller or jet, and the different types of wings. In this episode, we are going to go over fuselage parts and settings and how to use those properly. We're going to go over some helpful tips using some mods and some light XML editing. This will be broken up into separate segments with timestamps included in the description for you to skip to at your discretion. And don't be afraid when you heard XML editing, do not worry, I promise I will make this as painless as possible. It's very simple and there will be some resources to just make it a breeze. It's not difficult at all. Before we start this episode, go ahead and swing over into either the description or the Steam Workshop to pick up the Fine Tuner and Overload mods. These are very important for this video, and while you can probably do without them, they are literally a lifesaver in terms of making buildings easier. You will see why later. However, if you do not have Steam, check out the description. I will include links, and they each have their own download tutorials. If you are on Steam, just go over to the Steam Workshop and subscribe to them. Easy as that. Just make sure you pick them up before you start. So in the last few episodes, we've been building our aircraft with blocks like this, and while there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, there's definitely a better way to go. Blocks are quite restrictive in terms of building proper shape, width, and etc. You can get much more customizability out of fuselage pieces, which can be found under the structural at the very top, fuselage block. Now these beautiful things, this is what you will do most of your building with. Unlike regular block pieces, which, well, they're very blockly and can be ugly, fuselage pieces allow for much more customizability and really let your builds take shape, especially once you get good with them. Now, obviously this build isn't necessarily on the level we'll be getting to today, but this is something you can look forward to building. Let's begin by checking out fuselage block settings. By clicking the gear over here under Part Properties, you'll notice you can add fuel, buoyancy, deadweight, and smooth the front and back. These two are new options I haven't yet experimented with, but the fuel, buoyancy, and deadweight are very nice to have as they allow you to fully balance aircraft. Also, fuselage blocks can hold much more fuel than the traditional 20-gallon tanks that you find under regular settings. Next, we will click on Edit Fuselage Shape, and this is where it gets interesting. Here, there's backwards and forwards button. We will go to those momentarily, but here we can edit the length of the block, the rise of the block, and the run of the block. The length is self-explanatory, it's how long the fuselage block can be. The rise is how much it slants up or down depending on what value it is. Going in the positive, slants it downward, and going the other way, slants it upwards. It is relative to the default orientation of the fuselage block itself. So if you rotate it, the rise and run can switch around. Just bear that in mind. Run is left to right, and this is a poor angle to view it as. Run is left to right. You can type in integers to these values, however, length cannot exceed 10 and rise and run cannot exceed 5. If we click forwards or backwards, it brings up a whole new option. There is width, height, and corner selection. Now, there's an add section button. We will get to that momentarily. However, we will focus here on the width and height options. This allows you to change each end of the fuselage, and the corners allow you to change how it is rounded. There's hard corners, completely circular corners, and manual. This will come in handy later whenever you want to experiment. There's also curved and smooth. The default option is curved. Personally, I prefer either curved or circular unless the design asks me to take hard or smooth. Sometimes it's manual, but most of the time I use either curved or circular. You can use these settings in both the front and back end of the fuselage to change each individually. If you want to get more detailed with your fuselage, you might choose to add smaller sections. You can do this by hitting Add Section, it attaches one to the end, and if you lower the length, you can more fine-tune your fuselage shape into something a bit smoother than you might get just by using one large fuselage. This can be very useful when you are trying to make a nose cone, a custom nose cone. Obviously, you could just go to Parts, Structural, and add a fuselage cone at the end. However, I personally prefer to make my own nose cone. One thing to note about adding new parts like this is you'll notice that the corners didn't exactly match up. The way you fix this is by going under Settings, Edit Fuselage Shape, go to the joint, and then toggle through the corners and it will right itself. It's somewhat annoying, but you can work around it. Now I've gone ahead and made a fuselage segment, which we will add wings to. However, first I would like to discuss nudging, and this is another major concept that you will end up using. By holding Shift and pressing either Q, E, W, S, A, and D, you can nudge parts inside of each other. These are very slight shifts, but they are shifts nonetheless, and you can hold down the keybind if you want to shift it rapidly at a time. If we select the engine in the back, for example, and hold Shift E, the engine will nudge itself forward into the fuselage. Now, since I'm not particularly fond of the way the engine looks in terms of jutting out from the fuselage, I personally prefer to nudge the engine inside of the fuselage, so it looks something like this. I let the cowling sit on the back and try and get it as smooth as possible, like so. This way it's not as jarring out the back, and personally, it's up to preference. So if you prefer having an engine stick out, go ahead. There's nothing wrong with it, and it's your build. Nudging also presents a unique opportunity to bypass these boring canopies we're given and make something truly nice. For example, we can take another fuselage block and place it on top here. Go ahead and make it a little bit smaller than the fuselage, but not so small that it's smaller than the canopy which you wish to replace. For me, I'm just going to use 1.75 cylinder right here in width and height, length of 2. And then I'm going to hold Shift and hold S to nudge it downwards into the fuselage like so. I'm going to go ahead and move this up as well using Shift E, so that it's a bit more forward on the craft since that's where I want the canopy to be. Next, I'm going to place my cockpit directly on top and hold Shift S. All the way until the canopy is not visible. Now, all I do is simply take the next canopy, or more fuselage pieces, and finish the canopy. Sometimes it bugs and doesn't show you part properties on the side. Go ahead and click on another fuselage piece and then back to correct that. It's a small bug. And sometimes when you're editing settings, it will detach. Do not worry, you can nudge it back into place or simply reattach it if you so please. Sometimes you might find it's more efficient to just make the entire fuselage piece and then nudge them individually into place, but it's all up to you. I've gone ahead and completed the canopy profile. I've painted the part I want to be viewed as glass in a different color, but of course you don't have to do this. This is extra detailing, and you can paint your craft however you'd like. This is, again, personal preference. But by now, you have probably noticed one issue. By nudging parts inside of the other, how are we going to get to it? That's the canopy right there, slightly sticking out, but I can't select it without moving this fuselage out of the way, which detaches the entire craft. However, this is why we have Fine Tuner. There's a fun little exploit you can do with it by opening up Fine Tuner, entering multi-select by either pressing the button down here or pressing Tab, selecting the pieces that you want to multi-select, and then backing out of it entirely. Now, you have free reign to select whatever is inside, and then once you want to have the parts reappear, because they're still there, you can see the outline. Once you want to have those reappear, go back into here, press Tab to stop multi-select, and boom, the parts are back. This trick makes it really, really easy to get inside your craft and edit internals, as a lot of your craft will be internals, or at least parts nudged into each other, and you can see the overall profile here and how much nudging has been done. This just makes building so much easier, and it's a fun exploit I don't really see my friends doing all that much. Next, we're going to add our wings. Something common you'll find while nudging wings and fuselages is that the game will bug out and not let you edit any portion of the wing. Don't worry if this happens, you'll just have to take the wing out, place it back down on top, edit it from there, and then nudge it inside. Next, we'll go ahead and add our landing gears. I like to nudge my nose landing gear inside and rotate it a bit, but it is entirely up to you. You can rotate parts by clicking on this little rotate arrow and then clicking this right here, which is transform part. Now that the gear's in place, you may notice that the center of mass and center of lift are off balance. Additionally, the wheels are actually in front of the center of mass, which is a whole other problem, which we shall correct using the dead weight option with the fuselages. Go ahead and select one on the nose, just pick one. I'm going to pick one a bit closer to the center so that I can add a little more weight to the craft without tipping it so far forward. Click on settings, and then go ahead and add a bit of dead weight, and you'll notice that shifts the center of mass forward. Now, apparently I have to add a bit more forward, which is fine, I accounted for that. We'll go ahead and leave it balanced about right here. That should keep the aircraft relatively stable and add enough weight in the front. I'm going to add a very slight amount of weight in the back just to weigh down the craft a little more, as this engine is very, very powerful, and I don't want the craft to be just ridiculously fast. Next, we'll go ahead and add the fuel. Now, if you'll notice, I took out all the fuel inside of the wings, and this is for a reason. I generally don't put fuel in my wings, and if I do, they are concealed. We are going to add fuel using a little bit of XML editing, nudging, and our good old friend, the fuselage piece. Go ahead and pick out a fuselage block and add it to the top. We will place this directly on top of the center of mass, like so. Next, we're going to go ahead and shrink it down to size. Doesn't have to be too large, doesn't have to be too small, but definitely small enough to fit inside of the fuselage. I'll keep mine at about that size. I'm going to go ahead and replace it on top of the center of mass. Next, we're going to add fuel to it, so under settings, drag that fuel slider up. Now note that the amount of fuel that can be held in fuselages is volumetric, so the larger your fuselage is, the more fuel you can hold. However, smaller fuselages, they don't really hold much. 78 liters isn't a whole lot, and this engine will eat through it in a few seconds. This is where the XML editing comes in. Go ahead and back out of part properties and open override, which is this little emblem down at the bottom, looks like an aircraft. This is the overload mod. Go ahead and pop it up. It's a nice, simple UI. Now, these are a ton of values, not all you need to worry about right now, as we won't be focusing on them, but it would help to play around with them. This edits the code and can basically trick SimplePlanes into thinking that a part is doing more or is different than what you put down. It's a pretty fun way to break the game, or just make it better. Now, the option we're looking for isn't under part, so go ahead and click on the list, it'll drop down, and select fuselage. Next, you'll notice there is a nice little fuel percentage option. This is a percentage of fuel that the fuselage is able to carry, and it multiplies. Now, 1 is 100%, 0.1 is 10%, you get the point. Now, we have 78 liters, but say we want to have a little more than that. You can see the fuel here at the bottom is currently 78 liters. The fuselage currently on top of the plane, which is going to be a fuel tank, has 78 liters of fuel, and that is all the fuel in the craft. Let's say we want to make that above 500. We can go ahead and set this fuel percentage to 10. Once you're done, go down here and click on the check mark. All of a sudden, you'll notice we have 781 liters of fuel. If we click on the settings again, it's broken. If we move the slider even a bit, it goes back down to 78. This is a way to push parts past their constraints, but, you know, since we're not really looking for realism, I mean, you can do the math yourself, we're just looking to have fun. So back to 10 it goes. 781 liters should be enough to fly this aircraft for a decent amount of time. The reason we placed it directly on the center of mass is because as the fuel depletes, so does the weight, and that can tend to shift the center of mass around and make an aircraft perform differently once you run out of fuel. For example, if you put this fuel tank in the nose, the aircraft would be a lot more stable and a lot less maneuverable near the start of its flight time, but near the end, when you're almost out of fuel, it would be a lot more unstable, on top of a lot lighter and a lot nippier. Next, we're just going to go ahead and shift this fuselage down into the main body of the aircraft. until it's no longer visible. That will be the fuel tank, and you can see it right in there. Again, you can use the fine tuner tool to make parts temporarily invisible so you can place stuff inside. If we really wanted to, you could place more fuselages than this, but this is enough for me. 781 is good. Now this aircraft should be flight ready, so let's take it for a spin. Naturally, I was wrong about that last statement. We forgot about air intakes, but instead of doing it the boring way, we can do it the better way and make everything extremely overcomplicated. So let's go ahead and add some fuselage blocks and some fuselage air intakes, just enough to make it look nice. Now that that's done, we can take it for a spin. Now we can notice that the aircraft is quite maneuverable, but it is also quite unstable. If I pull too much angle of attack, I mean, yeah, I'll get the angle of attack, but it doesn't right itself. That might be a lost control. Nope, we're good. Which means this aircraft would be very difficult to fly on a regular keyboard. I'm using a joystick, which helps immensely. But for those without finer control capabilities, it's probably a crash. Just like that. To fix it, all it takes is a quick addition of some weight to the nose, just to further move the center of mass. Either that or add more lifting surfaces, as just reducing the angle of attack would help reduce the instability. Much better. No more loss of control, although the roll rate is still pretty aggressive. It is not as unstable as it was. Now, while I was flying that aircraft, I noticed that I didn't really feel good about how powerful the engine was. It didn't really feel right. The aircraft was going way too fast, accelerating way too quickly, and performing way too well. Now, of course, I could, just opt to fly at a lower throttle, but this is SimplePlanes. Let's just XML edit the engine. Clicking on the engine and opening up Override, switching from part to engine. There's a power multiplier, exhaust scale, and you can also edit the color of the engine. I won't be editing the color for now, as this uses hex values. However, I can edit the power multiplier. If I want it to perform a bit worse, we can change the power multiplier from 1 to 0.5. Clicking accept and going back into the flight. You notice that the engine is significantly weaker. Something to note is that when you mirror a part with rotations, at least in a certain axis, it may not mirror correctly, just like you saw there. Just something to keep in mind. I didn't even know that until now. And one more thing you can do with engines is completely eviscerate their spool up time. You notice that when you go fly an aircraft, or specifically a jet engine, and you power up the engine, it takes a little bit for it to get to full thrust. However, there's a way around that with XML editing. Although it may actually get rid of the afterburner effect, it does get rid of a lot of the spool time on the engine and makes it more responsive. You can do this by editing the input controller. The minimum of 0, that's your 0 throttle, and then the maximum is 1. We can change the max down to, say, 0.5. When you set to 0% throttle on the engine, it'll be 0, and then when you set to 100%, that will be 0.5. So that means you won't be getting the afterburner effect, but your max throttle will occur a lot sooner since you only have to spool up to half of what it previously was. However, in doing so, you also limit the amount of thrust it produces, so you do want to double that power multiplier, so we're going to set it back to 1. We'll get the same performance. The difference is our engine will be a lot more responsive. Also no afterburner effects, or at least any of the cool purple trail behind it. But here's max throttle. You'll see we're already there, we're already accelerating, and we can cut throttle very quickly, we can apply it very quickly. It's a much more responsive engine. We just lose out on, number 1, the higher volume, and number 2, the afterburner effects. Now, XML editing in of itself goes a lot further beyond just editing throttle or fuel values. There's more to it, and if you're interested in looking at it, so long as you have the overload mod, I have left a very, very helpful document in the description. It details all of the possible XML values you can enter into Override, or overload, sorry. It details all of the inputs you can put into overload to all the different parts, so you can edit values to your heart's content. You can make some very funny builds, you can make some very blatantly overpowered builds, and you can break the game to your heart's content. However, the overload mod is a very, very powerful tool not to be overlooked. So the best measure here is practice. I'm not particularly the best person to explain it, but learning it will be very worth your while. Anywho, that is it for this episode. We have discussed fuselages, nudging, fine-tuner tricks, and the overload mod. If you all enjoyed, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe. That would be greatly appreciated. I'm not quite sure when part 4 will be coming out, as I have yet to draft anything on that. However, if it is requested, I can get to work on that as soon as possible. Just leave a comment saying, hey, Kavi, work on part 4, please, I need part 4. Additionally, on part 2, I actually got sent a build. Someone learned off of part 2 and linked a build, and I want to see more like that. So if you build something that you're particularly proud of using the tips here, or even using your own building abilities, feel free to link it in the description below, and I would love to have a look at it. Anywho, once again, that's it. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one.